I try to heat set early so I don't forget to do it. When using several inks and paints, as I am on these pieces, I heat set for the longest recommended time. I usually work from the back, and if I'm doing very much at all, I open a window and try to get some cross ventilation going. I put my iron on the hottest setting with no steam, and the bobbin stitching on the back helps me find the right areas to heat set, and I just refer back and forth to the front. I tend to overdo heat setting because I've had to repaint a whole batch of purse tops. I think the actual problem there might have been that I didn't allow them to dry long enough before heat setting them, but when you repaint, it's never as good as the original, because now the piece has been washed and is rumply, and it's relatively hard to get into the little nooks and crannies while you paint. Use a press cloth if you're concerned about scorching, which is more likely to happen so that it's noticeable with light fabrics. You can heat set with a moving iron. Because I make stuff to sell and I'm often working on a deadline, I just tend to use a timer, and I usually don't have my iron moving because I really want each area to stay hot long enough for sure. After you've done a few of these, using the paints and inks that you're working with, you'll find a good rhythm. Next, I wash and dry my pieces on normal. Be prepared to pull a ratty mess from the dryer. You can also roll your piece in a towel and then air dry it, but find a way to do that in a way that won't stretch it out at all. Some people like raw edge applique that is untrimmed. I always trim mine, even pot holders. Before I do this, I fill it with steam from my iron and pat it flat on my cutting mat or elsewhere. My ruler helps smooth it out nicely, and then I let it cool completely. You can trim a piece that's still wrinkled, but I think it is too easy to miss areas because it's harder to see the work. Most of my piece is already trimmed, but I still need to trim up the rest of this. A tape, lint roller, and curved embroidery scissors really streamline this chore. So does Netflix. My large piece, which isn't very complex in terms of the number of frayed edges, used 10 sheets of tape from the roller. My mini only used 1. The prints on my full-size piece make a lot more clippings than the batiks I used on my little mini. After this, I fill my pieces with lots of steam from my iron and then dry them completely overnight to block them. The next morning, I'll be ready to do any final trimming and then bind. Here's my mini the next day. It is nice and flat. I'm happy about that. I've cut a piece of the same fabric as the frame border. I'll use it to turn my edge to the back to finish and bind the quilt. I'm showing this one first because it will make understanding the full-size binding easier. I'm hoping to capture some of the irregular edges of the inspiration frames. I definitely don't want my sides to be too straight. I've pinned my mini to the fabric right sides together. Now I'll draw my frame edges with blue chalk. I'm planning to make my corners a bit more rounded and fatter than regular 90-degree angles. This is another job best done with a walking foot. I am using light thread with this light fabric to minimize having my stitches show. If I didn't have a walking foot, rather than use a regular foot, I would probably free motion quilt around this edge, and I'm using a fairly small stitch, about a 2. I go around twice, stitching right over on the second pass. I try to keep my corners from getting too pointy, and I just overlap my ends rather than back stitching. I trim my edge carefully at between 1/8 of an inch and 3/16 of an inch, and I cut the corners diagonally and clip into my one inside corner. Then I cut a hole in the fabric and make a long slit to turn the entire piece right sides out. I carefully push out the corners with a metal turning rod. At the iron, I press the edges carefully with steam and then trim away the center of the fabric so that a perimeter about 2 inches wide remains all the way around. Now, I could just downsize this margin and whip it down now, but I've been experimenting with Peltex 71F lately, kind that is fusible on one side, and I wanted to show you what I'm working on. This is a much bigger margin than I will need, but we're in that territory where we can always cut more away, but we can't add any back. So I'm willing to waste a little material. First, I use a pencil to draw the shape of my piece on the fusible side of the Peltex. I need to trim it carefully, little by little, to get it just the right size so that it fits inside my binding, but it doesn't buckle or bunch up anywhere. A little small in a few areas is better than having it be too big in a few areas. I also try not to crease my Peltex too much as I'm getting it fitted at this stage. I keep trimming my Peltex until it fits well, and then I cut out the center so that I have this frame that's the right size and shape to fit inside. Remember, we're competing with this trimmed seam on the inside that is 2 layers of fabric plus batting. Next, I put it inside and I carefully fuse it to the piece, and it fuses to the added fabric, not the quilted part of the mini, if I've done it properly. If I need to reposition the Peltex, I carefully pull the fusible from the fabric, minimizing how stretched out everything gets. Then I reposition and refuse. As I'm working, I want to gently pull on the fabric so that the edge doesn't tend to slop towards the front of the piece. I would prefer that you didn't see much of this added fabric, even though if you do, it won't look bad. It's the same fabric, and you could purposefully do it all the way around, and it could look pretty cool. Now I will trim and press under my fabric so that I can whip stitch it all the way around to the backing fabric. This new fabric actually folds under the Peltex, and then I put in pins as I go. I'm trying to stay pretty close to the Peltex, but I'm not going to sew through the Peltex, which is why I want just a little narrow 1/4 of an inch or even a little less between my stitching line and the Peltex. The Peltex is fused, but I don't want, if it comes unfused, I don't want it floating around a great distance inside there. A few notches clipped in concave areas will help. There aren't really any straight lines here, and so this doesn't have to be straight, or it can be straight, just whatever works and gives you this edge that will help retain the Peltex where it's supposed to be without forcing you to sew through the Peltex, which may cause your piece to buckle ultimately, or for you to have to sew this down so loosely that it's not a nice snug fit. This whole job is a little bit fussy. Take your time to get it the best you can, and then check all your sides at the end. Do this also while you stitch and finalize this. When I hand sew, I'll take extra care with the corners, turning under the edge all the way and taking a few extra stitches. I never sew all the way through the quilt if I can help it, and I look constantly at the other side to make sure that I haven't. It is okay to catch some of the batting as you're whipping this down. When it's done, it will look like this. You can see that I've left plenty of room to add a separate hanging sleeve with the same lath that I use on all my bound pieces. First, I want to catch up with the full-size piece. That edge is, I always say this and it drives my husband nuts, it's the same but different. This is what I have so far. Okay, so once you have this, there are lots of things we could do. Part of me, most would like to see this with a narrow double binding just in black or something like that as a little tiny little frame around it. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do one that shows one more idea of ways to add interest and complexity when we're making a quilt. And I'm going to go ahead and do a turned edge, and I'm not going to make it straight. And the only difference between the way that I did the binding on the wood grain frame is that I'm going to plant some extra fabric in here to add a little bit more to these bushes. And the first thing I'll do is trim a hair off my piece, not making it too straight. The last thing we want is for it to look like we tried to make it straight and failed. For those who don't want to use a 30 by 21 inch piece of fabric to turn this binding, we'll use 2-inch strips. Here you can see how I've planted more peacock bush fabric under my binding. I'm drawing with chalk to show you how this could be stitched later. It also gives potential to have things hang off the edge of the quilt. Most people won't want to do this, especially if you have a machine that's not loving sewing through a lot of layers. Also, free motion quilting like this takes a lot of practice. Next, I'll pin on my strips, which are cut selvage to selvage, so that the pin heads stick way out, because I'll actually stitch from the other side and I need to be able to see my pins to pull them. So here's a little mock-up to show you what this needs to look like at each corner. If you have this peacock bush fabric here, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. What I'm going to do is take my two pieces, and I need to cut a little bit away to make these a little narrower, and then finger crease these back. So they're essentially like hems, like hemmed facings. The reason I don't just use a narrower strip is so that I have an opportunity to come really far in and put essentially like notches in the edge of the quilt if I want my edge finished that way. And so I'm using 2-inch strips, otherwise I would be limited by that. So this needs to be like this, and then this one comes over the top and it needs to do the same thing. It has part of it cut away and then this folded down. And then the pinning in the corner is the trickiest part. I want to be able to see my pin with my fabrics under here. This exact positioning with the horizontal piece on top means that when I turn this over and put it in the machine, the overlap is less likely to catch as I sew around the corner. My back looks something like this, all pinned up. So here I am at the machine. I really want the corner to be positioned correctly when I get there, so I'll make sure everything looks okay from the top side, and if anything looks amiss, I'll investigate and figure out what's going wrong. I carefully stitch around the whole perimeter with about a 2 and black thread using my walking foot. I'm only stitching 1/4 inch from the cut edge of the quilt. The fabric strip sticks out further in most places. Then I'm going to trim everything about 1/8 of an inch again, no less. It could be a little more. I also quickly trim about 1/4 inch from my strips while they are easily accessible. I have to trim more later on when I do the hand sewing. And I push out my corners carefully. All of this is a little harder with the strips than it was on the mini with one large piece of fabric. It's especially harder at the iron. Remember when I first pressed the mini while the whole piece of fabric was intact? That forces those edges into place, and you don't have to get your fingers very close to the edge. Here I have to use my fingers, which have been a little Teflon in the past, but right now they're pretty sensitive to the heat, and this can get pretty hot to handle. But by working little by little, steaming it up, letting it cool, then pinning it into place, I can work my way around until I like the way it looks on the front. Once I like what I've got on the front, then I can go ahead and pin the edges of my binding on the back. Once I have it all pinned, I can whip it down. I have this all stitched exactly the way that I want, and there are a couple places where I stitched it a little different than the way it was pressed. And so I'm just ironing those in from behind. I'm willing to put a lot of steam into my piece, but I am watching how much shine I'm putting onto my fabric. I really don't want to press in a ton of shine, but a little bit is on the back is acceptable to me. You know, everybody has their own aesthetic. I've sewn it all the way around. I've tried to keep my stitches very small. I used black thread. I trimmed out a little bit more of this binding if I needed to, and I just sort of tried to get it positioned exactly so that it would lay the way I wanted on the front side, which basically looks like this. And now I've set it up so that I have to deal with these, which I kind of don't know why I needed to complicate things, but I did, so I'm going to do that. So I really don't think it ever hurts to really get an idea of how visible your thread's going to be with the little thread Audition. I didn't invent that cute little idea, but it's very descriptive of what you're doing. So as I look at the three ideas, for some reason I like the pink because it's almost like it pulls this into a circle in my mind. I don't know if it'll have that effect once I stitch it. If you decide to try this, you could use your mock-up to test quilting through a sewn binding like this. Please respect your machine's limitations. I plan ahead and sketch with chalk and proceed slowly. I get a look at my back. It looks good. I'm okay with my stitching the way it looks through the sewn binding. This plays into that whole thing of in what order was this constructed. After stitching, I decide to trim out the center of each peacock feather on these new foreground bushes. I don't trim out the centers on the old ones. I won't be washing this, so I brush it vigorously to really make it fray. If I wanted to, I could spray it with a little water while I'm doing this, which would really help get those ends to felt up. I'm not sure if I'll do that at some point. I've covered both the hanging sleeve and the wooden lath on YouTube, so I'll post those videos in the lesson activities. I'll also post a PDF which briefly explains how I make them. In the next video, we'll address my punch list and add any embellishments to make this all it can be. It's funny, but I've been marveling to my husband all along that you guys already know what this looks like since before you signed up for the class. For me, it has been a process of discovery. I hope you're enjoying the process of discovering your own piece, as I've enjoyed finding this one. So this is what I have so far. Thanks.